Okay, cool. So first of all, I just wanted to say thanks all for having me. Thank you to Sam. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I just flew in this morning, so this is my first OWASP event, certainly the London event, so please go easy on me. Um, my name is Trevor Young. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Security Compass. We're one of the sponsors. The original abstract I put was security by design, not injection. And I decided to change it up a little bit because I was thinking to myself, you know, most of the people in this organization, in the audience tonight, you guys were probably very well versed with injections coming in to the development team as being on the security side. And so what can I add in terms of value to you guys? And I think there's a lot of lessons I've learned from talking to a lot of our customers and prospects and things like that. So I'm going to do a little bit more storytelling tonight and tell you about some of the failures that I've observed from talking to people, as well as some of the success stories. A bit about myself. So I've been at Security Compass for just under 5 years now. I have a technical background. I did my master's in computer science at UBC and my undergrad in computer science at Waterloo in Canada. So I spent about half my career doing software development and leading development teams. And then I switched over to the dark side about 12 years ago. And I've been doing more product management, and both as an individual contributor as well as a leader. Ironically, I didn't really notice this until I joined Security Compass and spent a lot more time thinking about security compliance. But a lot of the startups and the companies that I worked with up until this point were highly regulated. So banking, fintech, payments, online trading, online wagering, and programmatic advertising. So I've been both a developer as well as a product manager, and I've seen a lot of the requirements coming down, whether they're security, privacy, or compliance requirements. So I have a good understanding of sort of what happens on both sides of the table. And what I wanted to do today, so one of the things I think that I can help share with you guys that's unique to my position is on the product management side, I end up talking to a lot of senior leaders in application security, as well as individual practitioners. And mostly I just get to listen. So I get to listen to what their problems are, how they're trying to solve them. And then we look at ways we can incorporate those into our products and services and help them get over some of these humps. And so as a result of that, I've talked to a lot of companies of varying sizes who run into all kinds of challenges when they're trying to implement security by design. And so I wanted to share a couple of those stories today. And just to be clear, Security Compass, we call ourselves the security by design company. And so this is sort of most of the customers that we talk to are already bought into it, and they're looking for a solution in security by design, which is fairly unique because it's somewhat of a small segment out there. So before I get started, I'm sure all of you guys already know what security by design is. I'm not going to go into the details. You guys are probably also way more technical than I am at this point. And so I just wanted to start with a bit of a metaphor. This is how I always explain it to people that are new, and there's usually a couple of newbies in the crowd. But the way we look at it is similar to how you're building a house. So I'm sure it's similar here in North America and Canada, but there's building codes and there's regulations and there's laws that you have to adhere to. And so if you're building a house and you don't pay any attention to those regulations or those bylaws or those policies, and you just build it, and then at the end you bring the inspector to come in and they identify all kinds of problems with the infrastructure or the way you build it, you have to go back and rebuild it again before the person you're selling it to can move in. And that can be very costly, and that can take a lot of time, and you're going to start to really alienate the people that are waiting to move in. And that's the metaphor that I use. We tend to do software in that way as well, in that a lot of companies that I work with don't actually do secure by design. They don't think about some of these things up front. And so they end up building the software, and then after the fact, they look at remediating any of the security issues or the compliance issues. And that usually ends up in them having to rework a lot of software. That takes time, that takes money. The people that they're delivering it for tend to get a little annoyed at that. And so this is sort of the metaphor that I use. When I translate that into the software development lifecycle, it gets a little bit more concrete. And so this is how we think about security by design at Security Compass. But when you look at the DevSecOps lifecycle, it's really everything in that plan stage through to the coding stage. So the typical use cases or the processes that we see implemented in a secured by design environment, it starts with training. I would say that's not necessarily sort of the process itself, but it's sort of a requirement. You have to understand what secure design is and what secure development is. And then usually threat modeling is one of the more popular processes that people use in the design stage. And then security requirements. So you sort of go beyond the identification of threats and vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and then you generate requirements or compliance, security, and privacy to make sure that the software team knows what they need to implement before they actually start writing code. And then you can propagate that into the secure coding standard or the secure coding framework, where you're actually then going and testing whether you've made the right implementation changes or not. And usually when our customers are coming to us, there's a couple key things that they're looking for. Primarily, they're looking to reduce risk. I think that's the most obvious one. Some of them are already doing this, but they're doing it in a manual way. And so they're looking to reduce the costs of doing it. So they're looking to automate some of these processes. And then they usually want to do it at scale. So we work with a lot of very large companies. And oftentimes they've started an initial adoption. They don't have the resources to support large development teams. And so they're looking to wait for other ways to sort of scale that across the organization. And then the last one tends to be around compliance. So at least in the highly regulated industries, you have to continually prove that you're adhering to the regulations, that you're compliant. Otherwise, you could lose your business license, or you could have a major fine that can have major brand reputational damage to you. And so these are some of the reasons that our customers and our prospects are looking for when they come to us. And this is how we usually frame it. So I just wanted to sort of set the context of when I'm talking about some of these stories and security by design. This is largely what I'm referring to. Although I'd love to hear from you guys afterwards if you guys are doing anything different when it comes to design, which is anything really before you start writing code, either in an iterative process or in a greenfield process. And then just to provide a little bit more context, so in terms of some of the stories I'm going to talk to you guys about, most of the companies that we work with are highly regulated. So they're in fintech or they're in financial services, manufacturing. So they have a lot of compliance requirements. They build a lot of software. So usually it's the larger companies that are highly regulated that have to start thinking more heavily about security. And so they'll usually have hundreds, if not thousands, of developers on staff building a lot of projects over the year. And a lot of them are in the $1 billion range of revenue on a yearly basis. And then they have a high level of AppSec maturity is what I would call it. So they already have invested budget and dollars in a team, and they know that they want to do this or they have to do it. And so this is the sort of class of people that I've been talking to. And I talk to CISOs, I talk to individual practitioners, but I just wanted to set the stage a little bit because, one of the ironies I think about application security is that it's often the larger companies that are on the more bleeding edge because they have to adhere to a lot of these things, and they have much more strict implications if they aren't secure. And it's the startups who usually are on that front that are probably the least secure. They're not necessarily pushing the needle on these things. So ironically, these large, regulated, slower moving technology companies or fintech companies tend to be on the bleeding edge of some of the application security. And that's why a lot of them are adopting secure by design. So of the people I talk to, they generally fall into sort of one of two buckets, or one bucket, and then they sort of finally move over to the other one. But most people are coming from a find and fix attitude. So the typical adoption of security or application security is that they do it after the testing, in the testing or the build stage. So they're either doing penetration testing or they're doing scanning on vulnerabilities or software composition analysis. But they're usually doing things after they've built the code, and then they go back and find it and fix it. I've been trying to promote this predict and prevent. So this is where you actually look at the design before you start to actually cut code, and then you try to prevent. You try to identify some of the potential threats, and then you try to remediate those or include them in the requirements so they don't actually ever appear in the software on the end. Most people are in the find and fix stage. The group that I would say are bought into secure by design move towards the predict and prevent. But really, they end up doing both. So almost everybody starts with that find and fix, and then a small amount of them move over to that predict and prevent. And that tends to be who we end up working with quite a bit. And it's growing. A lot of people are really starting to recognize the benefits of it. And so we're gradually converting more people to move over that way. But that's sort of the framing I wanted to provide. So within that predict and prevent, the people that are looking to adopt secure by design, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And I've been lucky to be in the position where we work with a lot of these people that are attempting to implement secure by design, and they don't always get it right. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of things that go wrong when they attempt to do this, in the hopes that you guys can learn from that. And if you run into these situations yourselves, maybe you can avoid them. And then I'll try to come back and talk about a few of the success stories as well. And I'll apologize right away by saying that using things like Dolly and image generation from AI can be a great way to procrastinate when you're doing a presentation. So I've got a few of these in here. I spent a lot of time playing around with this stuff. It's a lot of fun. But the first story I want to tell you guys about is death by 1,000 injections. And so this can happen in a couple ways. And you guys are probably very familiar with injections. We work a lot with large development teams and security teams, and we try to get them to see sort of eye to eye and come up with a collaborative solution. But what often happens is that the development teams get pretty alienated by the security teams, whether they're doing vulnerability scanning or pen testing or threat modeling. the end result ends up being tickets that get into their backlog. And so they get hundreds and hundreds of these tickets that they have to remediate. And then that tends to take over some of the roadmap, and they get to deliver less features as part of their product. And they're spending a lot of their time on security and compliance. Being on the product side of things, I'm constantly battling with the compliance officers and their security teams to try to keep a good balance there. But no matter what you do, there's always going to be lots of bugs that get found and lots of vulnerabilities. And so that creates a really big mess. But even outside of this find and fix, in the predict and prevent stage, that happens as well. So I'm going to tell a couple of stories. Now, these are common scenarios that we've come across over the last couple of years. There are specific examples, numerous examples where these are coming up. So I provided sort of an amalgam of the company profiles and the scenarios. I'm not trying to call out any individual companies or anything like that, but I experienced these real hand, and we have a lot of feedback, and so I wanted to share some of this. But this one in particular, one that stood out for me was a bit of a novel one. It was a smaller company in terms of who we deal with in the automotive space. They had about 500 employees, closing in on 80 million in revenue. They had a fairly mature development process, so they did a lot of cloud and container applications, and they had a microservices model where you could build on top of microservices and wrap a front end around it. Their main goal was they had to prove that whatever they were building was being used by the automotive industry, had to adhere to those standards. And so they had to enforce security and compliance policies and then prove that before they could sell their products. So their typical process was they'd look at all the projects, they would assess and classify the risks. It would either go down the path of, okay, this is not a critical asset, and so it can go the lighter path, or it goes down a more scrutinous path where they have to do a little bit more process around it. And so as part of that, they wanted to automate a lot of the assessment, a lot of the analysis, and a lot of the triaging of those tickets, and then automatically put it into the developer's backlog so they could just implement those and move on their merry way. This is sort of an oversimplified view of what they had done, but typical microservices architecture, you've got your data storage at the top. But what was interesting, so they had microservices that were built on other microservices, and then they would have front-end applications, usually web apps or embedded apps and firmware that were building on top of those. And they had development teams, usually at the front-end app, and then they had some teams that were building one or more microservices. And one of the challenges that they ran into with this process was when they would discover, say, a threat or vulnerability or weakness at the top of that stack, it would propagate all the way through. So each one of these teams would fill out a survey, or they would provide some information and details on the project they were building. And they had to list all the technology components that were in that project. And then based on that, the team would assess it automatically, discover any of the main critical requirements that they needed implemented or controls, and then they would inject those as tickets into the backlogs of the development teams. So what would happen is if they would find a vulnerability up here, that would propagate down into this team's backlog, this team's backlog, this team's. Even if you did it at this microservices level, it was getting duplicated into 4 teams, none of whom could actually resolve the issue, because it was actually a DevOps team at the very top that had to remediate that issue in the database. And so now you take this times, say, 100 teams, times 1,000 vulnerabilities. This was creating a huge headache for the developers. They were getting all these tickets that were injected into their backlogs, and most of them couldn't do anything about it. And so there was a lot of backlash between them and the security teams. And so they had to go back to the drawing board. They spent probably 6 or 7 months kind of discovering this process. They made some remediation, they made some corrections to it, and eventually were able to get over it. But they wasted almost a year in going through this. Now they did get some benefits out of it, but it took them a while to sort of realize what was going on and then go back and course correct it. So, this is one of the things where, putting a little bit of effort up front to understand what your development team's model is can really help. And so what they did was they changed their model to reflect the nature of the reusable microservices they had so that it wouldn't propagate down. And then they implemented an inheritance model. So if a component at the top of the stack had marked that they had remediated a vulnerability or they had addressed a critical issue, that would get propagated down. And so the team wouldn't actually get that in their backlog and they wouldn't have to address it. And if it was fixed at the top, that would also get propagated down. And so the end result was actually quite good, but the pain that they took to get there was something that could have been easily avoided had they spent a little bit more time understanding the different development models and making sure that their security processes were aligned with the development team's models. So the next story I've got is measure twice, fix once. So this is a North American saying, but when you're doing construction or carpentry, there's the saying is measure twice and cut once to make sure that you aren't wasting that time and wasting materials or having to go back and rebuild something. This is actually one where I've come across this issue several times in the last couple of years, actually, and particularly as companies have been cutting their budgets and laying off staff and getting really tight on that front. I've noticed two sort of patterns. One of them is, when people are interested in secure by design and they're looking to sort of implement it in their organization, if it requires budget, it requires tooling, it requires anything, they need to make a business case for it. And so that's sort of the first time that you need to be able to understand what you're actually going to do from a business perspective. What's the impact that this new process or this new program is going to have? And then the other part is you have to be able to justify that on an ongoing basis. But in particular, when things get tight, the business leaders are going to come down, or the finance team, and they're going to want to understand what is the value that you're generating to the business. So this happened with like 5 or 6 different organizations over the last couple of years because times have been a little tight. But the one I'm thinking of in particular was a large US multinational company, 100,000 employees, over 50 billion in revenue. They had a mix of software, hardware, product, services. Basically, they did everything. And they had a secure design process where they had a team of experts. They would support the development teams in reviewing security plans, requirements, threat modeling, compliance guidance, and everything. So they had a very good process. They were really bought into the people and process and technology. But what happened was there was some major cuts at the company, and they got asked to justify sort of the program they were building. And they had been building this program up for a while. It had been running fairly good, but I think they sort of lost sight of the original business case. They had all kinds of really great technical metrics, but they couldn't translate that into business value, which meant it was really hard for them to justify the process and the program that they had implemented on an ongoing basis. So I wanted to call it 2 things. One, I won't spend much time on this. When you're building the initial business case, there's lots of support you can get that's out there. I would say vendors often have a lot of this data. We have ROI calculators and total economic impact reports. Take them with a grain of salt. A lot of vendors have them, but you can use those as templates, and you can lean on product managers. So my team in particular tend to have a bit more technical background than the finance folks, and they build business cases all the time for new products and features. And my team always works with their engineering team when they want to introduce something new. And so you have people that can support you in making that original business case. So if you're struggling to really get people to buy into secure by design, there's all kinds of data and metrics out there that we've pulled that you can use to sort of build that initial business case. But the main point I wanted to make, the lesson here, and we saw this play out over and over again, is that once you get that business case and you start running your program, there's technical metrics that you guys are going to measure, burn down charts and things like that. But you have to be able to tie that back to actual dollars and cents to justify the ongoing return on the investment that they made. Maybe you won't necessarily have to do it on a year-over-year basis, but at some point, if things get a little bit tight, the finance team is going to come down and they're going to ask your leader, and then he's going to need help justifying that. And so, in terms of the actual impact, of the lessons to be learned here, again, the initial business case, lean on vendors, lean on the supporting data. There's lots of stuff that's out there. The other thing I would say is distinguish between proactive versus reactive. So reactive is more of the find and fix. Proactive is more of the secure by design. And so often you're already going to have find and fix. And so if you can distinguish between those two and you can separate the value that you're getting from each, it makes it a lot easier. The last one is making sure that you translate those technical metrics into the business impact. And then when you do, make sure those reports are getting read by the executives or by your leaders in the team. So it's one thing to just build the reports and say you've got them if needed, but it's another thing to actually go and make sure that they're reading them and they're understanding them so they're constantly bought in, and then they know what the actual ROI is on those programs. And so this is something that often doesn't get all the way down to sort of the practitioner level, but we've seen this play out time and again, and particularly in the last couple of years. So make sure that you have that ability to measure impact. And probably the most important thing is to have a benchmark of where you were when you started. And a lot of teams didn't collect this information. So if you're measuring the impact on cost savings because it's hours spent by a security practitioner, or whether it's risks reduced, or whether it's controls implemented, make sure you have all of that from the beginning. And then you have the ability to measure that on a monthly, quarterly, or yearly basis so you can actually see if things are improving. And in some cases, you might find out that it's not, and it's not worth keeping the program in place. But if you don't have that, then you don't even have a fighting chance. And people are going to say, okay, you've been running this program for a while, and we can't see the results that you're getting out of it. And so it's going to be one of the first things that will get cut. All right, the last fail story I've got for you guys is was a bit of a unique one. I call it betting on a silver bullet, specifically an AI silver bullet. So this one's come up a couple of times, but this is an extreme example that I thought was really interesting. And so this is a company, a global management consulting firm. tens of thousands of employees, tens of billions in revenue. They have expertise in software design and delivery across all kinds of verticals and technologies. They spend a lot of time focusing on cloud native and big data, but they're secure by design process. So they had to prove to clients that the software they delivered was secure and compliant. So if they were building software for a bank, they had to be able to have that audit trail and be able to provide all of that information. And so they had a secure design process that had been in place for a bit. And they had a new CISO that came in. And this was at about the peak of the AI hype in 2023. And he basically issued this memo that said they were freezing budgets for all AppSec programs unless you can prove that AI can't replace what you're doing today. And so he threw down the gauntlet. This created a huge tizzy across all the cybersecurity teams within that organization. We felt it within the AppSec side of it. But the teams, they hadn't really started playing around with AI yet. They knew about it. But this was, whether he did it as a way to challenge the team or whether he was trying to make a name for himself, it was quite a bold move on his part. And so the teams that we were working with, they really didn't know what to do. They were trying to justify the program that they'd built up and they've been using for a couple of years. Again, they didn't necessarily have all those metrics to prove the ROI. They knew it was valuable. They had some of those metrics. But we ended up working with them. And so the lessons that I think are worth sharing here. So we ended up sort of looking at the experiment. So if you identify all the areas within your current processes that could be automated with AI, and then we tested those. And so luckily I have a team of researchers and we'd been doing this already on our own. We produce a lot of secure requirements and compliance best practices and guidelines in our library. And so we had done some of this, and so we were able to help them out. We had already gone through with a number of experiments for a lot of different use cases, and we had already understood some of the challenges and the limitations in there. And so they did actually end up sort of going back and doing some of this on their own, and they were able to sort of maintain the program that they had. But the other lesson I'd say that is worth identifying there is, usually when your leadership team or the execs are coming down and asking you to explore something and look for an alternative solution, and I have to say, everything from the board on down to the exec knows about AI. There's all kinds of promises around it. So, I saw this over and over again. But usually the answer is do nothing. We've got this sorted out. So you have to sort of take baby steps, give them something, throw them a bone. If there's one small area you can start to apply AI and you want to be able to explore it, make sure that they know about that and that they know that you're moving in that direction. But the other thing you need to do is really support and educate the leaders on the impact. So a lot of the times they're just reading the headlines or they're hearing some of the studies that are coming out and all the great things that AI could do, but they don't know how that translates down into reality and what the benefits are and what the risks are around it. And so I think you have to work with those leaders, set the appropriate expectations, have your data, and make sure you have something that you can lean on to make a small incremental change. Now, maybe that there's something that you guys are doing today that AI could fully replace, and it would be great. I'm still waiting for that date. There's a lot of opportunities there, but a lot of them aren't quite paying off yet. But that was another one that I thought was fairly unique. So the CISO in question is no longer at the organization, and things have kind of moved back to normal. Now, I do have to say they are one of the early adopters of some of our AI features and technologies. So they've definitely taken the approach of trying to apply it, but it's not quite having the impact that they expected it would be. But they're moving in the right direction, and they'll be prepared to move when it does sort of improve the models and things like that. So those are the main ones. We do a lot of these. So if you want to hear more, our CEO did one on anti-patterns and secure by design at IC2 recently. I think that's on our website. We've got lots of good resources and blogs. We run into these all the time, and so we have lots to share. I do want to end it on a bit of a happy note, though, and talk about some of the teams that are pulling it off. And so again, like these teams, even the ones that did run into these failures, they course corrected and they were able to get themselves back on track. They wasted months, years, weeks in getting there, which was a lot of time and money. But some of these teams have been doing it for a while, and I wanted to share a couple of success stories that we've seen as well. One of them is another large manufacturing organization. They've been doing this for quite a while. They were a customer of ours even before I joined. But they have a really good process that they put people through where they start with foundational sort of education, secure coding at the bottom. Everybody goes through that. And then they gradually move people into a champion's role. So they have an embedded security champion in all of their Scrum teams across their organization. And then they move those towards more of a self-servicing team. So they're trying to get their development teams to do a lot of these processes, to automate a lot of these processes. And they've done a really great job, probably the best I've seen in terms of actually having a great secure design process. They've got metrics to back it up. And they have this self-service model that a lot of customers I talk to want to get there, but it's very, very hard. And this organization probably took several years to get there. But they have done it really well, and they had a very sort of phased approach to getting their developers trained up, getting them embedded into those security teams, and then having those security teams become self-servicing. And then they have a centralized application security team that's in a support mode. And that frees them up to do a lot of other things that they wouldn't otherwise have to do if they're going and chasing down teams and helping them implement tickets. Another one that I thought was pretty interesting, and I only got one more to share after this, and then I'll move on. There are opportunities to use AI, and there's a couple of companies that are exploring some of this, and there's some unique ways that they're doing it. The main part is that they want to start with the least disruptive to the development team, because developers, if they don't accept what your process is, if it adds a lot to their backlog, they're going to reject it, they're going to push back, and it's going to make your life a lot harder. And they do a best effort, so they want to start slowly. And so what they've been doing is they're taking any design or development artifacts the development team already has, and they ingest those into a main system. So they're importing design documents, requirements documents, architecture diagrams, codes, code repositories. And so they ingest that, and they either have a rules engine or they're using some AI to basically create a view of that system model and then some of the business implications of that model. So instead of actually having people go fill out surveys or draw diagrams or have them sit in meetings and do whiteboarding sessions, they're trying to automate as much as they can to get a best effort. And so far, it's been a pretty good job. It can get maybe 60, 70% of the way there. I think they're hoping to get about 80% of the way there. But the outside of that, they review, they automatically generate threats, controls, and requirements. And then they have a recommendation, both on the training side, as well as the requirements and control side that gets handed over to the dev teams. And so they start slowly. And at this point, the dev team doesn't really have to do anything except maybe connect an application or upload a file. And then they get an output of saying, okay, here are the top 10 things you should be concerned about. And so again, this is still a work in progress, but there are some companies that are leveraging AI and they're getting there. And I thought this approach was quite unique, where they try to start and be as minimal disruptive as possible to the development teams to get them comfortable with it, and then roll it out from there. And then the last one, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but the one that I wanted to just highlight, we work a lot with the Department of Defense in the US, and they have some large software factories, they call them. And this is probably one of the best examples I've seen of secure by design at scale. So all vendors, all projects, all have to go through a continuous authority to operate program. And so they essentially have this repository of hardened components. So every vendor, every software they build internally goes into this hardened repository of reusable components, and then teams can develop off of that. So they're starting from a situation where they already have hardened components that they can build on, and they don't have to do everything. So now there's a very rigorous process they go through. They spend a lot of time and they invest a lot of effort into doing this, and it has taken them some time to get there, and it's just starting to really have an impact. But I would encourage everybody to go. It's all public information. There's nothing I'm sharing here that's private. If you look up Iron Bank for the Department of Defense, they have a really great description of it. And again, this is a model that wouldn't be possible to implement at most organizations, but sort of the idea of it is good, where you're actually doing the security hardening up front, and then you're providing some of those secure components and making them available for the development teams to build on afterwards. So these are just some of the examples that I've come across. Again, I know I'm not going to this is probably the least technical talk that you guys are going to have all night, but I thought what I could share was some of the things that we've seen across companies and organizations who have attempted to and are doing secure by design at scale, security and compliance by design at scale. So it is possible. It's getting easier. A lot of this stuff is able to be automated. Honestly, the biggest hurdle you tend to face is that initial business case to get the team to adopt it. And then the onboarding of the development teams. They have to be on board with whatever you guys are doing. They're ultimately the ones that are going to implement all of those threats that they uncover and the requirements that you send to them. But if they're not on board, then it's really hard to get the program up and running, and then measuring all those metrics to make sure you can justify it on an ongoing basis. But that's what I wanted to share with you guys tonight. Again, thanks, Sam, for inviting me, and thanks, you guys, for hosting me. Hopefully you enjoy the pizza and the beer afterwards, but that was the end of my talk. Okay, great.
So we had questions coming in from the online audience, and questions from the personal audience as well. So as you can guess, there was an AI question. Yeah. I'm not sure if you answered it fully, but the question was actually, Where have you seen Gen AI or LLMs actually add value? So you showed an example of what someone's doing, but have you seen them actually adding value?
Yeah, I would say what I've seen them adding value, but I would say that the promise of what they can do is usually more than what they actually end up doing in reality. So most of the stats you see out there with some of the things like Copilot and such claim that they can give you, you know, a 20 to 30% boost on productivity. I haven't personally seen that much. Where we have seen it, so within our group, within our product, our security team, we have a team that does a lot of research. So they go, they leverage a lot of the OWASP stuff, CIS benchmarks and things like that. But they're leveraging it in a research capacity on an ongoing basis. The problem is there's still a lot of hallucinations. And so what we do is we do a lot of the initial research on it, but we always have a human who's actually vetting it afterwards. And so, you know, it's probably saved them maybe 10% in terms of the actual overall hours that they're spending on the research that they do. Code generation is still a little bit up in the air. A lot of the models that are out there haven't been trained on secure code, and so that's not quite where we would like it to be. But yeah, most of the other stuff I've seen, people just automating simple tasks. So doing code reviews is one of the areas where I've seen a couple people using it. And then there's some of the other ones that are just like doing summarization of reporting and things like that. So far, a lot of people are testing. All of our customers are interested in it. Everybody's trying something with it. Not a lot of them have rolled it out yet. And a lot of them that are trying it are realizing there's still quite a bit of work there to be done. So there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of promise, but I would say there's still a lot of work before people are using it and getting a lot of value out of it.
Wonderful, thank you. There's one more question online, which reads, have you seen real business and tech improvements, usually around non-functional requirements or customer-facing features, that can be mapped or claimed by AppSec?
So can I read that again?
This is more around measurement, I think. Can you actually claim success? And so you did talk about metrics.
Yeah.
But what kind of metrics? How can that success be measured?
It's a great question. This is one of the biggest things most people struggle with. A lot of people capture a lot of data and metrics, but they're often vanity metrics, or they're not necessarily meaningful, or it's hard to tie it back. We have seen a couple of customers that have been able to do that. And again, it depends on what your goals and your objectives are. With customers who have been doing secure by design at scale already, and they've been doing it mostly manual, they've been able to measure how much it takes them to, say, complete a threat model or to remediate a vulnerability. And they've seen reductions in those. But you can't do that unless you've been measuring it beforehand. And so that's where, if you have the ability to measure it and you're capturing it regularly, then you can actually start to see what that change is and what that delta is over time. But I've seen customers that have been able to measure the cost reduction. So they say, you know, we have a person that spends 50 hours on this every month, and that's gone down to 25 hours, and they can translate that into an actual dollar value. Some of it is the state of compliance by project. So if you have 100 different projects and they all have to comply with different things, they can measure which ones are compliant or what degree they're compliant. So you can look across the board and say, like, oh, okay, 80% are fully compliant and 20% are only 50% of the way there. So there's a couple of areas like that we've seen. There's a lot of attempts to do sort of like a risk score or a calculation based on all this data. Usually that comes up with sort of an imaginary number. And it's like, we reduced our risk from 10 to 6. That's kind of hard to justify. It's hard to get past an executive because they don't know what that means. So you still have to really tie it back to something that's a little bit more concrete. But again, it depends on the nature of the objectives you have with the program. But usually it comes down to risk reduction, which is generally number, dollar savings in terms of how much you've been able to automate, or status of compliance to make sure that your business is still able to operate. Those are the main ones that I've seen.
Any questions from the audience?
Thank you for the talk. It's very nice. My main question was, I think I just asked on the slide on that. As you know, that talking about DevSecOps standards.
Yes.
Okay. For application. But the thing is, as you know, before we came into the DevSecOps version, let's say in the past, let's say decade or so, I think DevOps was the very first sort of methodologies for what do you call it, for programming applications and methodologies at that time. So, and as you know, that have you come across any sort of resistance from any like either companies who might have applications of that era, but they come to you and say, oh, you've got some security issues, but how would you deal with that?
Mm.
I'm sure you must have gotten resistance. Plus, they don't want to spend any much moolah at the same time.
Yeah, we get resistance all the time. Like I said, I think there's a small upper echelon of people that have bought into it. And when you start to go down into smaller companies, usually they just don't have the resources or the budget to actually implement it. We often see, companies that have 1,000 developers and they have 5 security specialists that are trying to support them. And so, with a meager budget, it's really hard to, go out and buy all the tools that are out there or build anything or automate any of those processes. So often they're looking for, something that is easy and still gets them where they want. And that doesn't always exist. And so they either don't do it. A lot of people just ignore it completely, or they revert to what they're doing already, which is usually a find and fix. So they think that scanning is enough. And we do see some people that believe that, AI is going to fix all their problems and they're waiting for that to fix all their problems. But I think they're going to be waiting a long time. I'm not sure if I answered your question or not. I guess, yes, we do see resistance. It comes in different forms, depends on the size of the company and what they're trying to achieve. Most people sort of agree with the idea of DevSecOps and they want to get there. There's a lot of different paths to getting there. And a lot of people feel that if they just get a scanner in place and they get pen testing and a couple other things, then they've sort of done their job and they call themselves DevSecOps. The reality is you have to look at what the measurements are for your business. Are you guys remediating all those risks? And if you're not, and you need to do something more, what are you going to do? And that's when they start to explore going a little bit further left.
Thank you, Luca. You advocate for security by design. Security is infinite, and you could spend a lot of time on it. When you start a new project and you want to do security by design, how would you choose threats or frameworks or whatever that you not have and that by design? Because that also could be the uses.
Yeah, this might be a cop-out. I'd say it's usually pretty dependent on the situation and the team and the objectives of the business. But if you're starting out, we usually recommend a lot of the common ones that are most likely to find, like OWASP Top 10 is a fantastic source. We try to keep people to minimize it, just to start slowly, because if you give, like you said, you can discover thousands of threats and vulnerabilities right out of the gates. There are a lot of scoring methods that are out there, but again, so in any of the processes, we usually recommend, and we often see that there's always a human in the mix that's doing that triaging, and they have to understand what the goals of the business are and what the main threats are to their software applications. And so there's usually somebody who is sort of that gatekeeper who is making those judgment calls. As a vendor, we can provide all the data and all the metrics and things that can help them, and we can make recommendations. But usually it's going to come down to something that's specific to that organization. In most cases, a lot of the organizations already have a list of controls, or they have a secure development policy that they want to implement. So that's typically their starting point. But that needs to get translated into actual threats or vulnerabilities that they need to remediate first. And so they often do this mapping exercise where they look at the map of all the possible things that could go wrong, and they overlap that with what their company goals are and their existing policies are, and they try to come up with a short list. But there's no sort of one answer that fits for everybody that I've seen.
In terms of coming back to AI, do you think that I think there's lots of talk. I think you took a diagram there where you were interested. You had an example where you were interested requirements.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's also already tools out there which use those and are all rules-based to get the threats out there. Do you think AI is more useful in filtering out what's positive and filtering out the noise rather than to actually generate? Because we can already generate it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what we've seen so far, so we've been testing in a couple areas. So you can import a diagram and start from there. We've been using AI vision models to import anything and try to craft sort of what that system model is. But at the end of the day, there's companies that are already doing this at scale and they're invested in it, and they do prefer a rules-based model. They want to have a lot of control. They need that. They need to see what they need, that deterministic outcome, right? But if you're a smaller team and you're just starting from scratch, there are some benefits you can get. So you can do a best effort and automatically get this, and you'll still get something. And I think that's better than nothing, which is what a lot of the teams are doing these days. But you do run the risk of having a hallucination. Now it's getting better and better. We've done a lot of sort of guardrails and prompt injection or prompting and things like that to try to get it there. But I would say at this point with AI, you can get a best effort, but it's a buyer beware. Like you still have to do some manual oversight to make sure that they're not giving you incorrect information or things like that. But if that's all you can sort of afford and you have a really small team, it's still better than nothing. But there's a level of, say, guardrails and sort of structure that you need to wrap around it to get the most out of it. Like if you just ask ChatGPT, you'll get something, but it's going to be random. It's going to be sort of like hit or miss depending what it is. So with a light layer on top of it, if you're a team that is doing nothing and you want to get started, I think there's some value there. If you're a large organization, you do that at scale, you need an audit trail. They tend to prefer the rules-based implementations, and they have a lot of control and they customize it quite a bit.